We start in the US, where Donald Trump has passed his first big test with Republican voters in his quest to become their 2024 presidential nominee. The former president has won the Iowa caucuses by a huge margin, edging out Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who came in at a distant second, ahead of former South Carolina Governor and ex-UN Ambassador Nikki Haley.
Trump's sweep of the Iowa caucuses is deep and wide, taking more than 50% of the vote and looking ever more likely to become the Republican presidential nominee for 2024.
And I really think this is time now for everybody, our country, to come together. We want to come together, whether it's Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. It would be so nice if we could come together and straighten out the world and straighten out the problems and straighten out all of the death and destruction that we're witnessing. That's practically never been like this.
Turnout was the lowest in over a decade. Voters had to turn up to cast their votes, braving freezing temperatures and treacherous conditions to reach hundreds of schools, churches, and community centers. With Trump securing victory all across Iowa, including the conservative, evangelical, and moderate counties, it was all about the race for the second place. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis eventually taking that spot. But despite taking only 21% of the vote, he's optimistic.
People want to have hope for this country's future, and that's what we represent. We represent a chance to reverse the madness that we've seen in this country, to reverse the decline of this country, and to give this country a new birth of freedom and a restoration of sanity. That's what we are going to do.
Following close behind was Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador during the Trump administration.
Trump and Biden are both about 80 years old. Trump and Biden both put our country trillions of dollars deeper in debt, and our kids will never forgive them for it. Trump and Biden both lack a vision for our country's future because both are consumed by the past.
The result in Iowa is significant, but the race to become the Republican presidential candidate is far from over. Trump, though, is one step closer to the rematch he wants with President Joe Biden.
And for more on this, I'm joined now by Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook. She's a political analyst at the Bertelsmann Foundation think tank here in Berlin. Welcome to DW. Thanks for your time today. Now, there are, of course, still a few months to go in the primary election season, but does this big win in Iowa mean that 2024 is likely to be a Trump-Biden rematch?
Well, it certainly gives the former president momentum he needs. Iowa hasn't classically been the best way to predict the final Republican nominee. In fact, they've gotten it wrong more than they've gotten it right. And we just heard that it was very, very low voter turnout, in part because of the weather. But nonetheless, Donald Trump, who is up against major lawsuits. In fact, he barely campaigned in Iowa because he was battling a criminal lawsuit in the state of New York on his business dealings, still needed this win. He needed it to be a sweep, and it was a clean sweep. So if the election were tomorrow, yes, it would be a standoff again between these two elder statesmen, if you will, Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Let's just have a closer look at those lawsuits that you were talking about there. Trump faces 91 felony counts across 4 criminal cases, including trying to overturn the 2020 election. And yet this clearly isn't a deal breaker for Republican voters, is it?
Well, it certainly wasn't a deal breaker for the Republican voters in Iowa. And in that way, they do mirror the country. 60% of Donald Trump's supporters and general Republicans believe, in fact, the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. But we are seeing an interesting numerical shift, at least in the surveys, is that if he were indicted in any of those lawsuits, and of course, right now, the Supreme Court is looking at 2 cases, one from Donald Trump about his immunity immunity, particularly in the case around January 6th, and then also looking at whether Donald Trump can remain on the ballot, that case that occurred in Colorado. So those kind of factors can still weigh in. 39% then of Republicans say that they could very well imagine switching their vote away from a Republican frontrunner named Donald Trump. And that's why it was interesting to watch the results between Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley today. And the biggest news, in fact, out of that Iowa race was that Ron DeSantis came in second and not the expected third. And that gives him some interesting momentum going into other ballot races now in New Hampshire and down the line.
OK, so no guarantees, and obviously we'll be watching closely in the coming months. But let's say Trump does become the Republican nominee and then goes on to win a second term. Give us your sense of what would a re-elected President Trump mean for America's democratic institutions?
Well, unlike 2016, we know a lot more about this president's agenda, and he's gotten a lot of help more recently from the Heritage Foundation and other conservative think tanks in their Project 2025, who have mapped out a manifest for conservative leadership. And in it, it becomes very clear in every single chapter that looks at every policy area relevant to the United States that the number one thing this president wants to do is deracinate the deep state, which is to say, bring America's bureaucracy, America's civil infrastructure into an ideological line. They've already recruited 5,400 people to run top-level jobs within the administration, which they didn't have in 2016. Nobody wanted to join the Trump administration because people were deeply unsure of where this was going. Now there's a written-out agenda, and it's a radical agenda. It's a radical agenda for Europe, specifically on foreign policy, on the strength of NATO, on support for Ukraine, on a continuation of support for Israel, lots of questions on the foreign policy end, but also on trade, on business. But fundamentally, the biggest concern is the changeover, the changes and the bleeding out of the functionality of American democracy. Everything becomes ideologized, everything becomes focused around the decision maker in the White House. That is not what the founding fathers intended.
Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Foundation, thanks so much for your insights there.
Very welcome.